royal house of Valois was the reigning monarchical house of France from the year 1328 to 1589. They didn't have the raw divine pomp and pageantry of their successors, the Bourbons. They didn't have the almost global conquest and European hegemony of Napoleon. And they certainly didn't have the high-minded ideals and brutal reality of the Revolution. But without them, none of the above would have been possible. So I ask that you join me, Sumatricus, as we explore their entire history across the course of centuries. Together, we shall delve into an often ignored section of French history. We shall explore how they came to power when no one, they themselves included, thought they would. We shall see how they grappled with the English in over 100 years of dynastic war. We shall study how their reforms set the groundwork for France to become a superpower, and we shall understand how they played the great game of politics, war, and nation building. This is the House of Valois. Welcome back, all of my infantrymen, my longbowmen, and my fellow battlers in the 100 Years' War. Last week we ended up finishing the reign of Philip VI, and this week we shall be moving on to his son, John II. Now, to talk about John, we will have to backdate a bit. We'll have to retread the same ground that we've already spoken about, so we can find out what John was doing before he became King of France. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. John was born in 1319. He was 9 years old when Philip VI became King of France, and due to Philip's sudden and unexpected rise to power, he had to consolidate his power quickly. So what better way to do it than the absolute super move of the medieval diplomatic game, a marriage? Philip decided that when John reached his majority at the age of 13, he was to be wed. Now, what do I mean when I say age of majority? I simply mean his legal age. He's able to drive a car, he's able to get on the beers, and he is able to get married at the tender young age of 13. So, when this idea was originally settled upon, there were a few options floating around for John to be married to. The first idea and option was for John to marry King Edward III's sister, Eleanor of Woodstock, but instead a Bohemian bride was chosen. Now, what is the Kingdom of Bohemia? The Kingdom of Bohemia is the modern-day Czech Republic, but it had existed as the Kingdom of Bohemia from the year 1198 until 1918. It had been independent for the majority of its existence, but the last couple of 100 years it was ruled over by the House of Habsburg and incorporated as part of the Austrian Empire. Now, the Kingdom of Bohemia was a big-time power player in the Holy Roman Empire. The King of Bohemia was the only king in the Holy Roman Empire, meaning that he had the second highest noble rank underneath the emperor himself. This meant that the King of Bohemia could draw upon reasonably sized armies, and he also had a large war chest, as it were, to assist his allies with. He was also a big power player when it came to internal German affairs. Whoever the King of Bohemia supported was probably going to win out unless their opponent was supported by the emperor himself. Now, when I say that the Kingdom of Bohemia was an elector in the Holy Roman Empire, what do I mean? So the Holy Roman Empire was, from the 1300s onwards, an elective monarchy. The electors came together at the death of an emperor, and they would elect a new one. For the last couple of 100 years of the existence of the empire, it had transformed into a hereditary monarchy under the House of Habsburg and the Austrian Empire. But for a good 100 years, it was a pretty powerful, oligarchy is a better word for it. But the electors were, first up, the spiritual electors, the Prince Archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier. Then the temporal electors, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg, and of course the King of Bohemia himself. Now, for all my history buffs out there, I'm sure you'll feel a little twinge of joy at the mention of Brandenburg. For all of you who don't know, Brandenburg will eventually transform into the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Kingdom of Prussia will eventually, using its dominant military might, unify Germany and create the first German Empire, which, give or take a few extra provinces, is the Germany we all know and love today. Now, to return back to France, the alliance between the Bohemian King John the Blind and Philip VI was struck for a couple of reasons. Now, first and foremost, France was looking for allies outside of the English sphere of influence, and who better to pick than one of the big heavy hitters of the empire. But there was another side to this, the Bohemian side. The Bohemian King John the Blind, also known as John of the House of Luxembourg, was pretty keen on becoming King of Lombardy. Lombardy is a region in northern Italy. It is now a modern state of the unified country of Italy, but it gets its name from the people who conquered the area during the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They took the region, they established their own kingdom, and they ruled there for so long that the region took on the same name as the people. The region would eventually transform during the early Renaissance into the duchies of Milan and Mantua. The alliance stipulated that Bohemia must supply France with 400 infantrymen if France ever entered war, and in return, France would not dispute the Bohemian claim to the crown of Lombardy. Now, for John's wife, Philip selected Bonne of Bohemia, mainly because she was closer to childbearing age, being 16 years old. Now, it's important to realise that during the medieval time, life expectancy was, on average, only 45 years. Infant mortality rates were between 30 and 50%. So people did not have long to live, and there is a lot of death. They're very accustomed to it. And also, the idea we have in our modern sensibilities of childhood, letting a person grow to become 18, or in some other places younger or older, did not exist back in this time. By the time you could walk and talk and hold a sword, that's what you did. You either helped your family on the farm, or you helped your family business, or you helped out becoming an apprentice in an artisan craft. And if you were a member of a royal house, you got involved in the politics of state. Now, of course, Bonne provided a dowry to, it would have been Philip who would have received the dowry, and her dowry was fixed at 120,000 florins. Now, what is a florin? A florin is a gold coin which was used in the Republic of Florence. Florence at this point in time had begun its transformation into an international banking superpower. For any of you who have ever been fascinated by the works of the Renaissance masters, a lot of these were paid for by this banking wealth and explicitly patronized by the first family of Florence, the Medicis, who for a long time were large and in charge in Florence, and were even able to get a few of their scions onto the papal throne. Now, a florin was the first gold coin struck in significant quantities in Europe since the 7th century. So we're really watching here the shift from a barter-based society into a cash-based society. At least the nobility and the various crown heads of Europe, they're all now dealing in vast quantities of gold coins. Now, this will lead into issues we suffer today, such as the debasement of currencies, where they'll reduce the purity of a coin from, let's say, 60-some% gold to 50-some% of gold. But we're definitely on the way. We're definitely on the way to moving towards the cash-based society, even though bartering does still occur. As I said, the nobles and kings of the lands of Europe are now starting to move into this coin-based economy, even though they do still have treasure, so, significant valuables, jewels, various finery, gold, silver, plates, and all that kind of stuff are still used and held in treasure vaults. Now, upon reaching his age of majority, 13, John was made Duke of Normandy Count of Anjou and Maine. He was married with 6,000 guests in attendance, and the festivities lasted 2 months due to the fact that he was also knighted at Notre Dame in Paris in front of many foreign nobles, including the King of Bohemia, the King of Navarre, and the Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Lorraine, and the Duke of Brabant. Now, these massive royal weddings, even though we're accustomed to smaller ones today, were par for the course back in the medieval Renaissance Enlightenment, pretty much up until the modern era. They were designed first and foremost as a show of monarchical power. Behold my wealth, behold my prestige, bow before me, see that I truly do possess the divine right of a king. And they were also an excellent tool to engender the populace into a favourable mindset about the monarchy. I mean, you really can't hate a fella who's providing you with, months upon months of circuses and free alcohol and free food. You're always going to be a fan of that. This technique, of course, is more than likely based on the Roman technique of emperors holding massive games when they claimed the imperial throne. Now, when John ascended to become Duke of Normandy in 1332, he had to deal with a few issues. One of them was that the great and good of Normandy supported the English. The Norman economic survival depended on trade with England, and they traded much more with England than they did along the main trade artery of the River Seine. Another big issue for John was the fact that many of the landed gentry in Normandy held land in both France and England. So to support either or monarchy risked getting their lands confiscated in either or kingdom. So of course, they don't really want a war. They don't want to be involved in a war. And they sure as hell don't want to declare their support for either side in a war, because if they do, they risk losing their own personal interest. And of course, in classic human fashion, personal interest trumps everything. Additionally, Normandy was governed as interdependent clans, which allowed them to obtain and maintain charters guaranteeing the duchy a measure of autonomy. The two main powers in the region were the Tancarville family and the Counts of Harcourt, which had been rivals for generations. Tensions boiled over in 1341 when Philip VI sent the bailiffs of Bayeux and Contin to quell dissent in the region. In response, a name from last week's episode makes one of his first appearances, Godfrey of Harcourt. Now, Godfrey has two pronunciations of his name. There is the English pronunciation, Godfrey Harcourt, and there is the French pronunciation, Geoffrey de Harcourt. Right, so if you see me jumping between those two different pronunciations, that's just because I have them written down as different names in my notes because of differing sources. So, Godfrey, in response to Philip's intervention, raised troops against the king and rallied a number of nobles who were protective of their autonomy and protective against royal interference. The rebels demanded that Geoffrey be made duke, thus guaranteeing the autonomy granted by their charters. Now, this is exactly what you don't want to do. This is the definition of thanks, I hate it. Now, if they had just gone to Philip and played the game, done the dance of a medieval court, had bowed before him and offered these ideas in petitions and with various incentives for the king, there is perhaps the option that Philip would have acquiesced to their request. Now, he probably wouldn't have, because due to the fact that John is already placed in as Duke, he's obviously not going to disinherit his son. But still, this is the worst possible way you could have done it. Open rebellion can never be tolerated. Open rebellion is a direct challenge to the authority of the monarch and therefore must be stamped out. And that's exactly what happened. Royal troops demolished the rebels, and Godfrey was exiled to Brabant, and of course he would go on to England to become an advisor to Edward III. Now, Godfrey here wasn't the only one to suffer the consequences. In fact, he got the least consequences because 3 of his allies were actually decapitated in Paris in 1344. Now, if these had been peasants rebelling, the executions would have been significantly harsher. They would have been tortured to death, and they would have been tortured to death publicly, and all the citizens of Paris would have come out and cheered and loved it, because to rebel against a king, especially as a peasant, as a commoner, is akin to a cardinal sin. I mean, it's so bad at the time that the church openly says that if you rebel against your king, you're going to hell. It's the same as breaking one of the Ten Commandments. Now, nobles could get away with it a bit more because, of course, they had blood claims, and it was, oh, well, I'm actually king and he's not, blah, 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 blah. But these three nobles were, of course, decapitated, and they were only decapitated because they were nobles, and nobles were entitled to a quick and semi-painless death. Now, to continue on, John was present at the peace talks between his father Philip VI and Edward III in Avignon in 1343. We don't believe that he did much during these peace talks. He was probably more there as a show of noble and familial support for Philip in the peace conference, which, of course, as we know from last week's episode, did not work out. To continue further on, by the time of the capitulation of Calais, Normandy had almost entirely defected to the English. John was dispatched by Philip to conduct a truce with the longtime rebel and now English ally Godfrey Harcourt. Philip agreed to return all confiscated goods and even appointed Godfrey sovereign captain in Normandy. He was a sovereign citizen. Watch out, don't tread on him. John, in a masterstroke, then approached the Tancarville family, whose loyalty and support would ensure his authority in Normandy. John arranged a marriage between the Tancarvilles' only heir, Jean, and the Viscount of Melun. This is an incredibly intelligent move, because he's now got half of this whole duchy in complete and total support of him. As you recall earlier on in the episode, the Tancarvilles are one of the two big power holders in Normandy, and now they are lockstep behind John. Now, what makes this an even better political play is the fact that with Godfrey as sovereign captain in Normandy, and Normandy still technically being part of France, if Godfrey teams up with the English again, he's violated his responsibility given to him by the king, and he's violated the chivalric and moral codes of the time, thus making him a contemptuous traitor, a low-born scum. If anything, for him to violate this chivalric code would be cause enough for Philip, or when John becomes king, to remove his status of nobility, which of course would allow them to take all his lands and legally destroy him. On the 11th of September, 1349, John's wife Bonne died at Malbuisson Abbey near Paris after succumbing to the plague. To escape the Black Death, John abandoned the city. Now, this was reasonably commonplace back in times of sickness, and it was not looked upon favourably by the citizens of the city, but looking back on it with 2020 hindsight, it makes complete sense, and is the smart move. I mean, if this dynasty is wiped out, then you enter into the possibility of civil war, whether between all your nobles or a foreign power absorbing your throne. So, if anything, it's better to keep yourself safe and make sure that your nation continues on with you. On the 9th of February, 1350, only 5 months after Bonne's death, John married Joan, Countess of Auvernhe. I apologise, sometimes these French names get away from me. But, fun fact, this region is known for its famous charcuterie, which they still celebrate today with various festivals. Apparently it's a big cheese-making region as well in modern France, and also Michelin tyres are produced here, which, you learn something new every day when you're researching about the House of Valois. Later that year, Philip VI died, and on the 22nd of August 1350, John became King of France, known to history as John II. His coronation took place at Rheims on the 26th of September, and his wife was crowned at the same time. Next week, we'll get properly stuck in to the reign of John II. We'll talk about his early reign, and maybe we'll be able to get his whole reign done then. Whether that episode comes out this week or next week, I'm not too sure. It depends if I get to it or not. But yeah, until then, I've been Symmetricus. Thank you for joining me for another absolutely stellar episode of the House of Valois. If you would like to follow us on Instagram and Twitter, please do. We love hearing from you, hearing your thoughts about the episodes. And if you'd like to toss a rating on the episode, that would also be greatly appreciated. For our YouTube listeners, toss a like, give us a subscribe if you'd like. And until next time, I will see you again on the House of Valois.